continuing and just kind of chatting about this idea of Israel is also just this idea, kind of like approach it from a lot of different angles, I guess. Like, is this the notion that, so say there's God in the heavenly kingdom, right? Say there's like this dominion that's like all these attributes of freedom, and it's like this certain dimension of God. You know, like even Jesus makes reference to like the kingdom is already present, you know, when they're asking him, because they're like, wait, what are you gonna we don't understand what you're making reference to, da 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 da. And he says something like, the kingdom is already present. So then it gives you, he starts making these type of like mystic references where they're just like, wait, what? You're not really saying the things that we think how you're gonna say it, you know, whatever. And so then it introduces this question of like, what do you mean it's already present? To some degree, what's limiting us? What's dividing? What's this felt divide then? And then it gets into what are these mechanisms, these like felt invisible separation between these otherwise revealed attributes of this like dimension or kingdom that we should already be able to function in, but we live like inhibited or like obstructed from. And so there's that question. So then imagine there's this like dominion of God, right? This like heaven. And it, you know, in some ways, maybe it makes reference to heaven, because then it's like, well, what's heaven? But heaven then becomes a word just to give a distinction that heaven is not the world. And then there's differences between like the world and earth like creation. And then there's like world, which is like the system, the kingdoms, the rulers, whatnot. And so there's all these different things of like, we don't exactly know about heaven. We just know that heaven is a different dominion that's not the world dominion. And then we have these descriptions of like, well, what are the attributes of that then? So then we have to start learning into these attributes and understanding of God and how to connect to increasing unto that dominion, unto this more free life in the midst of these obstructions, right? So then that's portions of the story. If you just keep kind of going into the idea of like, from the space of God or the heavens or this other alternative way of living that then is revealed to people in the story, that there's like this division, this felt division or obstruction, or basically just not living in the attributes of God. And then then, you know, you get to the question of Israel. So you imagine the idea. So let's try on the idea of like, so there's God in the dominion, right? And then he tries to work through some functions of these revelations through Israel. And so then there's these claims that Israel has this connection to functioning through this like dominion unto God, right? In the midst of it, strategizing some of these like political world delegations and negotiations and whatnot. And then it kind of gets into these notions that some people claim that Israel then has like a delegation unto God and some type of land claim. But I guess let's just imagine. So imagine God did like come down and said, Israel, we're going to use you to connect the lineage through Abraham to God, or to like this connection to God. And then I'm also going to give you certain claims to like property rights or land rights in reference to the world kingdom's governing criteria or whatever, what have you. And you know, like some type of like predefined boundary lines or something to that effect. And so then you would think like when he's kind of saying some of this to like Abraham and whatnot, Abraham would be like, well, where do we draw the boundary line? You know, maybe he would. Or no, wait, he would be like, oh, you mean the boundary lines that are already drawn? According to whom? And then he's like, the political boundary lines that are already drawn according to like various rulers in the region, right? And then he's like, okay, so these political boundary lines according to these dominions and rulers, from a dominion that God is not from. And so by what means are, like, what political standard are you giving them to me? Is that like China giving, like, someone in China's daughter, like, the state of Washington, or I don't know, something like that. And they're like, but by what standard? Like, by what political standard? Or something to that effect. And then they're like, so when you think about it along those terms, you realize that there's already some type of land outline, some kind of political boundary that seems to be referenced, but not from God's kingdom, but from the world political boundaries. And so in what way was God giving them those political boundaries? From within the world system, or from some part of the heavenly dominion, a different type of criteria or standard? And if it was from the heavenly dominion, then it would be prior to those political boundaries. And so then where do you draw the line? Like, where's the exact line if we're looking at exacting these claims from God? So anyway, you can think about that. We can think about that. Another thing to think about is, like, what was God even doing? What's the claim of, like, you're with God or against God? What is it to be against God in the reference there? If he's like, I invite you into being with me in the attributes of my side of things, or, whatever. And then they're like, well, or what? Or else what? So the idea there is that it's written into, there's blessings, there's life, there's this path of life, right? There's certain path of life, being within the path of life. And then there's supposed to be some kind of benefit of being within the path of life as opposed to what? As opposed to the world dominion, the world kingdom. As opposed to what, though? What are the attributes of the world dominion, the world kingdom? And so the attributes of the world kingdom are, it rises and falls, it collapses. There's this continual persistence in these certain territorial boundaries, these certain delegations, what have you. So it's basically supposed to be some type of blessing as like being within the path and attributes of God and God's dominion, not the world dominion. So then you start seeing those that like join into God so that you're a part of all of these other benefits, or else you have to go through learning the difficult way that the kingdoms of the world are not really something that you can depend on and be honest about and live in the attributes of life and the Game of Thrones, what have you. And so then it kind of gets into where people will say, well, from the Christian perspective, if they're talking about transitioning to even more of an inclusive stage of these revelations and going beyond these political boundaries, how are they claiming to go beyond those political boundaries? And in some way you could say because they're not bound by the political reference points of the world rulers and kingdoms, that they have a reference in relation to God from a different position, And they could say, well, what about when Jeremiah talked about having the deeds? The deed in reference to what? Is there a deed to the heavenly kingdom? And then what boundaries would that be? Or is it a deed in reference to positioning some of the last remnants in the world dominion to set it up toward investing in basically like collapsing the power of the world dominion, the boundaries, the political boundaries, and then being open to just like inclusive negotiating on the world stage beyond those political delegations. Just so much to think about. But then it's the idea of to be in the kingdom of God once again, or what? And then people will say, or go to hell or something like that, or go to hell. But it's still kind of like, what does that even mean? There's no description of hell. There's no description of heaven. We have the description of the attributes of the kingdom of God and the attributes of the kingdom of the world. And so any type of judgment in reference to the notion of hell or heaven falls within these definitions that we already have in terms of the kingdom of the world or the kingdom of hell. So once again, it's like the notion of what path and direction of life are you going to be in? Anyway, that's just kind of a side note of strange things I was thinking about. Another Israel ramble. But I think we kind of are getting into these questions of what is the distinction there? Like, what reference point are people making? How are they trying to create these boundary lines? Ultimately, I still feel like there's this inclusivity that it just continues to go continuously toward an increase into this mystery of what we call God's kingdom, God's dominion, God's attributes. It encapsulates and incorporates the path, the attributes of life, the attributes of negotiations of the law unto these standards of love and whatnot, and the prophetic calling encapsulated, pointing toward these ideas of life and love and freedom and whatnot. Just so we're just kind of looking at all these various attributes in reference to these things, and increasingly diminishing the felt regulations that come from the world system, being released from misunderstanding as to the attributes of God. So as it increases in revelation, we should have better understanding of this alignment and spiritual connection to God. We should be able to eventually fulfill the stages of tension in the legal domain that causes people to develop these certain laws and whatnot against each other's claims against humanity and things like that. There's just all of these things that should increase in these, like, this spiritual revelation as to, like, an increasingly freed creation and world. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that for now. I'm sure there's going to be other things that I'm just going to, as we're shifting to looking at what are the real claims going on there in terms of, like, land and political dominions and world dominions and the kingdom and da-da-da-da.